All right, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. Today, we have part 3 in our 3-part series, working towards the golden standard, increasing apprenticeship enrollments at the local workforce board level, part 3, measuring success. So if you can get through the title with us, then hopefully you can stick around for the next hour. We're really glad you could join us. As you come into the room, it'd be really great if you could introduce yourself in chat, tell us your name, where you're joining us from, and maybe a little bit something that brought you to the webinar. We had a really lively chat in the last 2 sessions, so it's really nice to hear from everybody. So as you come into the room, just feel free to introduce yourself in chat. And while you do that, I'll just walk a little bit through the webinar series to orient us, so where we've come from and where we're at today. Michelle has joined us today as well. So she'll be taking care of a little bit of technical assistance. Thanks, Michelle. And we're also here with Jackie Roberts from NotUp and the Center of Excellence. So thanks everybody for joining us. And I see a few folks are welcoming on the chat. So welcome, Marie. I think you were here before. Thanks for coming back. We have Carolyn, Mark. Thanks everyone for joining. So continue to do that. And again, I'll talk a little bit about the series as a whole. So let's take a look at the next slide. Okay, so over the past 3 months, our overarching goal in this series is to encourage movement on setting up or increasing activity towards enrollments in registered apprenticeship programs at your local level. So in our first session, and we started back in April, the first session was designed to help you explore obstacles to registered apprenticeship programs in your local area. So we started by looking at the problem with the goal to locate specific leverage points from which you can move the needle on increasing enrollments in registered apprenticeship programs. So if you missed that session, don't worry, we can put the recording into the chat. We've got a few other options for you as well. So I'm also just noticing that some folks are introducing themselves, so I'm just going to say hi. So Brent, welcome from Mississippi Valley. Thank you for joining us today. Brenda, Dr. Patricia McQueen, thanks for joining us today. It's really nice to see so many people. That's great. So Rochelle has just put the link to the recording for session 1. If you missed that, I do encourage you to go back. It's not necessary for today, but it's great to get a better understanding of the whole. Hi, Craig. Thanks for joining us today. All right, so that was session 1. Session 2, okay, so this was 1 month ago. In session 2, we took those leverage points and we brainstormed ways that we could make small and impactful changes in our local area to increase those enrollments in apprenticeship programs. So this is where we looked at different concrete actions that you can take to move things forward, and we're going to pick up with those today. So here's a recording to part 2. Again, Rochelle, I think is going to put that into chat for us. Thanks, Rochelle. And again, I'm going to pause and look at chat and say, welcome, Lisa, Annika, thanks for joining us today. I see Sheena has joined us. I think Craig, I already said hello, so welcome. Oh, there you got a little bit more. All right, it's joining us from Baltimore. Excellent. All right. So those first 2 parts bring us to right now, today, our 3rd part and final in this series, and that's on measuring success. So having a solution, right, for moving forward and moving the needle is one thing, but knowing whether it's successful or not is another. So we're going to finish this series by focusing on what success looks like and how we can measure it. So we have a couple more things for the chat for you. So lots of resources to take forward. We have a handout for the webinar series. So you could use it for today, but really it's for you to take away with you and work in conjunction with all of the materials. And Rochelle's going to, again, share that in chat along with a link to the NotUp page. Jackie's just shared that with us, so thanks, Jackie, where all of the materials for this whole series is held. And so if you want to go there and find recordings, report, like everything you need will be over there. So lots of resources to help you move forward. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about ways of participating today. So like in the other 2 sessions, today's session is both practical and participatory, although a little bit less. I am going to be talking a lot. I've got a lot to share, but I do have things for you to do both online today and after the fact. So again, that's why we get you to introduce your chat. It's really nice to sort of see who's online and what you can share. And then always, as we're sharing things, confidentially is always important. We're not going to be really talking about anything that, is essential, but always think about, we are public, but we want to share things that we can learn from, but leave the details behind. Okay, so let's talk about today's session, and we're going to be looking a little bit at measuring success. So that's the goal for today. So this series was really sparked by a report. Again, if you want to follow the link over to the Not Up page and the Center of Excellence, I believe the report is there, but we also have a link to it that you can see. And that report really put out a call to action to encourage us to move the needle on registered apprenticeships. So as we do that, we want to sort of mark our progress. So that was a report on state board reports. And so we want to be able to share back the things that we do in that. So measuring success, that's one reason why we do it. But we also want to know whether we're successful or not in our efforts, and whether we can continue and repeat and scale up on the actions that we've done, or potentially iterate because maybe they didn't go as well as we thought they did. And that's fine. We're always trying things out, and measuring our success tells us where to keep going and where to maybe iterate. So today, as we go through that, first we're going to review the first two sessions just to contextualize a little bit. And then we'll look at how to define success for your selected points of change. And so last time in our session, we closed and we had quite a few different ideas on things to move forward. So we'll use those today and bring them back. Okay. All projects, I think all projects really need to start with a vision of the future and what success looks like. This becomes your North Star. And when things get a little bit crunchy or go awry, as they often do in large projects, then you can recall your definition of success and get everyone aligned. Now, quite possibly, we also see that we may need to revision our North Star. That's okay too, but it's good to check back in. So once we know that what success looks like, we need to figure out how to track our progress towards success. So we'll look at different types of measures that we can use in workforce development and apply some of those measures to our ideas from last session. So that's when we'll bring our ideas together. And then finally, we'll create a short hypothesis statement to help articulate our goals. So this webinar is brought to you by the National Association of Workforce Development Professionals and the Center of Excellence, as well as Purpose Co. So I'll do a quick introduction. So I think some of you I've seen already. So hello again. If you're new, just tell us a little bit about us. My name is Erin. I'm a senior consultant in learning development at Purpose Co. And I've pretty much spent my entire life in education, training, and learning and development. So all of this is kind of my favorite place to be. And I'm here with Purpose Co., and we are a workforce development strategy, solution, design, and capacity building firm that specializes in designing and implementing custom workforce solutions that create sustainable outcomes for people and businesses. And so part of the practices that we'll be looking at today are part of the practices that we do at Purpose Co. So again, I'm also joined by Rochelle for technical assistance. So thanks, Rochelle and Jackie, for helping out today. So if you haven't already introduced yourself in chat and you've just joined us, please do so. And while you do that, I'm going to start our review from our first two sessions, just to make sure that we're all in line with what we're going to do today. So let's take a look at a little bit of review from session one. So we started by noting some highlights from this report that came out in March. And so the report is a workforce system registered apprenticeship baseline knowledge assessment report. So that's the name of the report. And this had the call to action to get us to work towards increasing enrollments in registered apprenticeship programs. So we took that call And we immediately brought it down to the local level. So here's a national call. Hey guys, we want to do something, but we know that workforce development happens at the local level. So we looked at it and explored the nature of the problem by teasing out behavior that we see in structures and mindsets and behavior, or sometimes lack of behavior, because we're looking for things that sometimes aren't happening yet. Then we turn these ideas or issues into design challenges with how might we questions. Now, again, if you missed session 1, you can catch up on all of this in our handout, on the video recording, etc. So it'd be good if you could go back and look at that if you have time to do that. Now, from that session, so we can actually go to the next slide. Awesome. I'm going to move through this a little bit quickly. So from that session, we received some results, right? So I asked everyone to put in their ideas, and some of the areas or leverage points we identified as ways to move the needle were, and this came from the group that were on the call, need for funding, need for PR campaign, lack of awareness of programs, lack of incentive, fear of trying new things. And so these were all just sort of crowdsourced ideas of why in that local area or local areas, things aren't moving ahead as maybe we'd like to have a little bit more action. Now, what was interesting is that those largely matched sort of the 4 key areas that were noted in this report. And so key areas of, continued technical assistance from the Center of Excellence will be in areas like knowledge mobilization. And this relates to our need for things like PR campaign and a lack of awareness of programs. There will also be continued technical assistance for collaboration. And while we may not have hit this directly in those concepts, we all know that collaboration and convening of individuals is required really for a lot of our ideas to come to fruition. And it's a huge part of workforce development. The other 2 pieces were capacity and funding. And so capacity building could really help with building awareness of apprenticeship programs. And of course, the ever elusive yet really important funding is necessary to get off the ground. And so, great. So Rochelle's gonna put into the chat just a link to that report so that you can see it. Great, awesome. All right. Okay. So let's take a look at identifying points of impact. So what we did, so we identified these are areas that we could use some work on. So that was session 1. And then session 2, what we did is we took those concepts or leverage points and we moved them forward. And what we were looking at in session 2 were points of impact. And that is, if the leverage point is the place in the system where we can create change, then the point of impact is what we're going to do about it. Like, what are we going to do? So then we brainstorm some ideas, some potential solutions, and then categorize them using this 2x2 grid, which is a great grid for, so here we're using kind of a classic impact implementation grid, which is a really great way to identify projects to work on and move forward. So looking at our findings on the slide here, we'll just, most of our ideas were sort of in that higher area there. And in the quick wins on the top left, we put ideas in this category because we think that it'll be high impact, but relatively easy to implement. So this is always a good place to start in a project. And we look here, we see things like listing and learning about things, kind of more on the easier side. And as we move towards major projects, we see things that encourage us to have, a higher level of commitment to the project, such as inviting companies to the table or looking for funding. So that requires a little bit more effort than, say, learning about apprenticeships or simply listing all the relevant companies. In major projects then, so sort of more over to the right, then we'll see items that are necessary probably to, the success of the program, but significant higher level of commitment. Like, yes, we are doing this, therefore we need to hire staff. Or yes, we're going to work in this sector with these areas, and therefore we're going to build a skills matrix. So those are things that take a lot of time and effort. And so the reason that we want to do this is we want to identify areas that we think that we can plan to start that are easier, and then also plan ahead for those larger projects. Okay, so that's a little bit on what we did in session 1 and 2. We explored the problem, and then we looked at ways to solve it. And that brings us to today, and that is looking at how to measure success. So we're going to put it all together at the end of today's session by crafting a hypothesis statement. So to get started on the measuring success piece, we're going to look at what does success look like. Great. Thanks, Rochelle. Okay. And so here I'm going to ask another question to the folks in the room today. And this is just to start and make it easy. So not necessarily focused on workforce development or apprenticeships, but what is something that you have succeeded at in your life? So I just want you to think about that in general. And how did you know that you were successful? And I wanted to start here because sometimes it's easier to focus on what success looks like and feels like in things like hobbies or sports. And then we can start to apply that back into our work organization. So if you can think of something, again, I'm asking you in the audience here, feel free to put something into the chat. So if you had something from work or school or life or hobbies that you do that you succeeded, how did you know that you succeeded in that thing? How did you feel? How did you celebrate? Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples from my life. So for example, I was a classroom instructor for about 13 years. I taught English as a second language at the university level. It was a very interesting and rewarding job. And sometimes I had very disengaged students. So believe it or not everyone loves to learn English as a second language. And so a big part of my success in that world was, working with some of the disengaged students and allowing them to come forth and engage in the class. So as a teacher, as an instructor, that was definitely, a successful moment for me. Another one, I practiced yoga. So doing a headstand was not something I was able to do at the very beginning. And so I set myself a year and said, wouldn't it be great if in a year I could do a headstand? And a year later, I came back and I just tried it just because, and I would just float it up so easily that I laughed and then fell back down immediately because I was so surprised that I was actually able to do it. And so those two things mark success for me in something else. So again, if anybody of you feel like you want to share your idea of success, we'd love to see it. I think it's really helpful sometimes to think about things in a smaller case before we go larger. But just to move things along, again, go ahead and put things in chat if you feel like it. But I'm going to swing that back around to what it looks like in a workforce development or apprenticeship focus. And we're going to use an example that we saw from last session. So I think, Rochelle, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. Great. And again, folks, if you have thinking about things, don't worry, you can still put it in chat. Just want to make sure that you get back to work on time. So I'm going to keep moving. All right. So if we're thinking about what success looks like, we want to sort of wrap that around to an example. And so this example we see on the board today, so build relationship with training providers and the employers they serve. This was an example that we saw from our last session. And we wanted to bring it forward so that we could look at what might success look like in this. So say we're trying to, move for, set this project in motion. And we want to think about, well, what could success look like in this? So again, if you want to focus on this in chat, I'd be really happy to see what you think. Yeah, go ahead, Rochelle, we can put that in there. So looking at this example and bringing the focus really back to that apprenticeship model, what would success look like in the project of building a relationship with training providers and the employers they serve? How would we know that we have succeeded in this adventure? So I'll give you again a minute just to think about that. And while you do that, again, I'll continue with a couple of ideas because I'm throwing this on it. Some of you may have seen this example from last time. We're going to work with this as we go through today's session. So if I were to review this at a higher level, and just sort of on first blush, I might say that there could be a lot of different indicators for success in this example. So a few that I thought of could be have a meeting with a local training provider and it goes well, right? So it just simply is a good meeting. So sometimes when we're starting out, we want to know that we've met with somebody and it goes well. And what does go well mean, right? And so one of the things that you could do as you start outreach in something like this is create a list of criteria or a rubric for how a meeting goes when you're doing outreach. And so one of the things that we do at Purpose Co is exactly that, is kind of have a rubric. And every time we meet with, say, an employer, we might look at things like, were they engaged? Are they prepared? Da, 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 da. And I've got a few examples I'll walk us through later. Other things that could show success in this example are training provider, the training provider that we meet with refers employers. And so we've got some solid employers and we're moving into that second area of this example, and that you reach out to employers. So those could be 3 indicators of success if this is going to be our focus moving forward. Great. Again, folks, I'm going to move forward. So I'm just looking at chat to see if I had any ideas. Feel free at any time to put your thoughts in chat or questions. Let's look at the second example. Thanks, Rochelle. Great. So this is another example that came forward from last session. And I really like this idea of working with libraries by involving coding and gaming. And so a lot of these examples that I've worked with, like I'm going to run with them a little bit. So if you're here online today and that was your example, I might be moving with it slightly differently, but that's okay. They're just examples for today. Okay. Now, if we really look at this action item, we'll notice that it's pretty big, actually. Like it seems like, oh, that's lovely and cute, but it's kind of a big thing to do. So in this one, I would definitely break it up into stages of either points of success, or in project management, we might call them milestones, right? And some of those could look like things like creating a list of libraries and contacts to engage. So again, starting small and making it really available. You might want to develop a plan or a story or a theory of change so that when you connect with those libraries and the stakeholders, that you have something that's you want to tell them and that they can receive, right? So if you want to share that story of change, is it something that those librarians would be like, yeah, that's a great idea. So I'm really big on this, is creating a change story. And that could be successful just having that done. Or what could success look like? Students attend these events and are hungry for more. So success is going to look slightly differently to everybody, depending on what your actual goal is for that. So I always think that it's important to start any project just by thinking about what does success look like, and it helps us as an alignment tool for your team. It helps us find that North Star and eliminate assumptions. So again, it's a really nice way to just get started. Now, from this sort of vision of success, we can move into the actual function of measuring success. So why don't we move into the next slide and talk a little bit about build, measure, learn. Great. Okay. So this need to define and measure success largely comes out of best practices in product design and management. So I also spent almost a decade in that space. And I really appreciated that because it gives me this really, really simple framework that I use all the time: build, measure, learn. It is a cycle and a feedback loop. So it's functional, but it's also a bit of a mindset. So when we create a product or service, or whatever we're trying to get out of our project and put it into the world, then we want to measure that customer impact and then learn from what we have seen and then iterate the design. So almost nothing that we put out into the world is perfect, the first round. And so the build, measure, learn mindset and framework allows us to then kind of go, okay, we're going to put something out there and we're going to watch, and then we're going to make it a little bit better. So in the cases that we've been looking at today, right, if you're looking at building relationships with training providers and employers they serve, then our customers are the training providers and those employers, right, the businesses. And as we know, relationship building in and of itself is both an art and a science. So you can always learn from your efforts and improve from them. So here, the product is relationship building, right? And we're going to put out what we think is going to work and then try it. And so, for example, right? So for example, using our cases here, if I reach out to 5 training providers and none of them respond, like 0 out of 5 respond, then I'm definitely going to investigate my outreach plan and see where I can improve it. All right, something didn't work. I should get better results from that. Right, so that's a cue: build, measure, learn. Measure 0 to 5. We want to do some learning here and see if we can take it second round. Same thing. So if I'm setting up a coding event or a hackathon at a local high school or library, and only 2 students register, I'm wondering if I can improve my outreach. So again, in these small, I'm going to put air quotes around that, actions that we're taking, anything in that space can be improved. Okay, so maybe they don't respond to email, they want to be called. Like sometimes channel of communication can be really important. So as you iterate, just think about the small ways you can do that. Okay, so I brought up build, measure, learn as a way to bring us into our evaluation strategy. So out of this concept and working in this field of developing programs, training products, engaging with businesses, employers, like all of these kinds of things, it's really important to have an evaluation strategy when you set up. And this really helps you sort of anchor down how to measure success. And so we see here on the slides that we have 8 points. I'm going to walk through them pretty quickly. And these are just sort of things that I've learned along the way. So 1, know your starting point. I think this is really important. So when we're starting, a future focused project, we're really looking at, that definition of success way out in the future. That's where we want to go. But we can't compare 3 months from now or 3 years from now to now, unless we have a very clear image of what now looks like. And so I highly recommend taking a snapshot of where you are now so that you can make that comparison. Okay, so using our example, I might say right now, currently, we have relationships with 3 training providers, and there are 3 more in our area. And with the 3 that we already work with, we have not yet discussed apprenticeships. And so that just lays that sort of benchmark from which we are moving forward, okay? And that's a starting point. And that really allows you to make comparisons later on. Okay, so don't forget to do that. People often, look forward, but forget to look at now. Number 2, really understand what you hope to achieve. So we just looked at that by, defining success, which is really important. And this will likely be some kind of specific number or measure that we're looking at so that you can solidify this into your hypothesis statement. So hang tight, we're going to walk through those actions in a moment. Number 3, which measures matter most? There's a lot of things you can measure. And if you're a bit of a data geek, you're like this and that and this and that. But really, we want to make sure that we focus on the measures that matter the most. And often this is like connected somewhat or completely with your organizational sort of strategy, right? So your strategy fits in with that. And together you're sort of creating things together. And so here we might be looking at X number of training providers are interested in apprenticeships, right? What are we really like? What does success really look like at the end of the day? Or X number of employers that are interested in apprenticeships. So these might be measures that matter most out of the examples we've been looking at. just checking chat to see if anyone's got questions. I'll keep going. I know I'm talking a lot today. We've got some work to cover here. So just so you can take this away with you. Number 4, how and when to collect that data. So how to collect it and when. So in this field, we often see things like surveys, focus groups, even anecdotal like stories like, oh yeah, I was listening to this guy say that. That's a form of data. And you just have to understand that it's maybe hearsay, or I heard someone say that. You may want to check in or validate on it, but it's also important information. When we're doing things like outreach, observational information is really important. So like you're doing your phone calls, you're sending out your emails. It's in and of itself is not something you can capture with a survey, but you can track it. So every email you send, track it down, put it on a sheet, right? We have great sheets that we use at Purpose Co for this kind of activity. Number 5, who, and this is important, who is going to analyze that data? So data is some people's strengths, but not everybody's, right? So I always say sort of work within your skill set, right? So if everybody on your team is a little like, oh, I don't know if that's my favorite thing to do, that's all right. Just keep it simple. If you have a data analyst on team, awesome. Bring them in and allow them to help you set up measures to analyze them. But we have to identify someone who's going to analyze the data. And then we also have to, in number 6, think about who we're going to communicate it to. So we're collecting this information and measuring our success, but who are we sending that to and how? So when you're setting up your evaluation strategy, think about, so for example, in the projects that I've worked on, I have to think about data that we're going to use as the core team. So I'm usually involved in that. Right? We want to look at all the detail and get right in there and read the comments and kind of go through all of it, good, bad, and ugly, because we're going to use it to make micro or macro decisions about what's next. But the further away from the project or higher up on the organizational ladder usually is lesser details. And we might be giving that information to them in like graphs or reports, or what I call slideguments. I don't know if you use these in your organization. They're like documents that are on slides for easier reading. Seems to be a very common thing, but we'll see this data come forth often in something like a slidegument. Okay, 2 more things about your evaluation strategy. So number 7, so important, schedule analysis points, because quite often, especially if collecting and using data in this way, it might be relatively newish. If it is in your organization, you may overlook that you have to look at it. And then you just sort of, you're collecting and everyone's like, well, what are we going to do with this? So when you start your project, I highly recommend that you schedule points along the project for you to check in on that data. And that's going to totally depend on your project. But some examples could be, in 3 months, we're going to look at this information. In 1 week, we're going to, like, depending on the scale, right? Or maybe it's event-based. And so you have one of your hackathons at a library, or a coding event at a library. And so that's an event, and we're going to collect data after that. And so knowing the logical points and how you're getting that data allows you to, move forward with it. And that brings us to point number 8, which is probably the most important. What action are you going to take with that data? So all of this, we're collecting all of this data so that we can move forward. And this brings us back to that build, measure, learn. We build something, we measure the success of it, and then we learn from it. And that learning is determining what's next. Right. So again, I talked earlier about, you might want to scale up. It's going great. Awesome. Woohoo. Scale up or keep going. Or you may come out of that and say, well, we contacted 15 businesses and only 2 responded. Then we need to learn about how we're doing that and if we want to keep going. So maybe pivot is important at that time. Okay, I'm going to take a breath. I've been talking a lot. I'm going to hand it over to you in a minute in a poll, but let's just take a look at where we are and where we're going. So we started by defining success and the importance of an evaluation strategy, sort of based on that build, measure, learn. So now what I want to do is look at different ways to measure. So we're going to go right down into some detail. So as we do this, we're going to continue to fold in some ideas from our last session so that we can apply these methods, again, keeping it focused on apprenticeship. And so, Rochelle, could I kindly ask if you could launch our poll? So we have one poll today. It's really trying to gauge whether or not you're comfortable with data. So what is your comfort level with data analysis? So, from everything from I'd rather not to I have a lot to learn, do it regularly. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of us right in the middle. And the reason I asked this is actually 10 years ago, I started a new job and I thought it was, mostly looking at training. And the company had actually just launched a analytics engine and I had to build a training program for it. And I didn't really know what data was at that point. So I started in the I'd rather not bucket and have slowly worked my way forward. So thanks, Rochelle. So I see that we're really solidly in the middle. So I know a little, I have a lot to learn. Great. So we know enough to move forward. Thanks, Rochelle. And that's really helpful. So I always ask this question just to get a sense of who's in the room. So thanks for being honest there. So as we go over the next couple of points, some of this may be familiar with you or for you. Some of this may be new. Just hang tight. We're going to go through some of the basics. And this is to sort of capture folks at, the higher end of that list. So that I'd rather not, or I have a lot to learn. All right. Rochelle, can we take a look at the next slide? Beautiful. All right. Fantastic. So when we're talking about data and tracking, one of the first things that we always talk about is the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. And I think that this is, just sort of at the basic level here. So in general, actually, let me step back a little bit here. So quantitative data, for those of you who are sort of just learning, welcome, is really about numbers-based. It's things that are countable, right, and measurable. So when we say, I got 0 out of 5 calls, that is quantitative data. Qualitative data, on the other hand, is more interpretation. So it can be a level of subjectivity with that, and it's often descriptive or relating to language. So when we ask for comments in a comment box, this is what we call qualitative data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can collect that information and then relate that back to our apprenticeship program. So in general, ways of collecting quantitative data, so again, numbers, counting, we often would see something like this in things like experiments or observations, surveys, polls. So we just did a poll, so kind of quantitative data, right? You could also get this in interviews or by attendance sheets, like 15 people attended this meeting, this program. So in the realm of getting started with partnerships to build apprenticeship programs, we're really looking at tracking the number of calls, emails, responses, attendance in meetings. So again, observing things, but tracking them down. So things that you can put in your evaluation strategies might be count how many organizations you want to reach out to, and then how many reached and how many responded, right? So right there, you have 3 numbers that you could do a little bit of comparison around. You may also want to do things like count how much time it takes to send out those emails and woo a prospective partner to the table, right? So even in sales, they would talk, or marketing, they would often talk about customer acquisition. I can't remember what it is now. That was from my tech days. But the idea is like, how much does it cost? It would be, how much does it cost to bring a customer on board? So in this case, we're thinking about how much time does it cost to get partners to the table? It could be a measure you're looking at. Qualitative data, on the other hand, so remember, we're looking at things that are more like comments or language. This can come from interviews, focus groups, surveys, observation, anecdotes, so listen to stories and case studies, so lots of different types of elements. And then relating that, again, back to building partnerships for apprenticeship programs, qualitative data could come from places like just simply reflection. So quite often, I don't know if you do this, but we might meet with a customer or client, whether that's a business or an employer. And at the end of the call, our team will hang on to the line for a little bit longer and discuss how that went. And that could be an element of qualitative data, and we might mark that down. And that takes us back to this kind of idea of a rating scale around engagement that could look like, how engaged were they? How prepared were they for the meeting? Did they have good questions? Do they have a need, right? Is this business, does it have a need for an apprenticeship program? Are they eager to take the next steps? Are they available to take the next steps? So each one of those items could be looked at in a rubric. So when you finish a meeting with a business or a training provider or somebody you're trying to get to the table, and you can rate how engaged they are and whether or not they're, this is a viable client to continue to work with. All right, so that's a little bit on qualitative and quantitative data. Now let's bring that right down to the workforce development world. And so on the next slide, what we have are some common measures that we see in workforce development. And this is, by no means exhaustive list, but it's a way to just sort of spark some interest in what we're looking at here. And so some of the things that we've already mentioned, like numbers of businesses engaged. So that could be number of training inviters or training providers engaged, right? So here we see these are all sort of like quantitative measures. We're counting. It's number of something or percentage of something over time. So these are really important. Now, we're going to move forward. Again, I'm just looking at the time. I want to make sure you get out of here on time as well. We're going to pack up all these slides and send it to you. So don't feel like you need to scramble that down in your notes. We'll send it over to you on the slides. But let's look at that in conjunction with one of the examples. So I'm going to leave that up for a second. And so look at sponsoring IT competitions for kids. So this was another, oh yeah, we do have that on the slide, thanks, awesome, great. So let's bring that down and take a look at what kinds of measures we could use in this case, right? So this is one of the examples from our last session. So if we were looking at ways to move the needle forward, we might pick this one. I think it's lovely. I highly recommend it. Do it. But if we were to measure the success on this, right? So now we've kind of gone from defining success to actually measuring it. So what could be some of those quantitative or qualitative measures that we could look at? So one of the things that here, and again, I just sort of ran with it a little bit, but we could set targets. For example, we're going to set a target to sponsor 5 IT competitions over the next year for something like that. And then we might say for students or kids aged 10 to 12, right? So, and again, just making this up a little bit, but the idea is we want to set a bar and then see if we're going to get there. And we want to get as specific as we possibly can. So I've selected a number of competitions, and I've also defined the ages. You may also do things like at these 3 schools, in these grades, in this section. So these are just examples to get you inspired. We could also count the number of students enrolled in the competitions and then attended. So again, being in education and training most of my life, registrations, enrollments versus attention or attendees, and then completion, right? So those are 3 measures that we often see very, very commonly in this world. Qualitative measures could be things like, how did the kids participate in the session? That might be observational, like they were really enthusiastic, they loved everything about it, or they were bored and they were distracted and looking at other things. And so it doesn't matter what that information is, it's just information that we take to make things better the next time. All right, I'm going to sort of move us forward a little bit. Again, pardon the pace of today's session. I just wanted to make sure I get some of this information over to you. Again, this is all in, or a lot of this is in your handouts, and we'll send over the slides. to give that to you. So if we're talking about data, I just wanted to throw in one. I kind of got inspired from this from the last Not Up conference, actually. And I thought this was really good. So I wanted to throw this in there. When we're talking about measuring success and tracking it, one of the things that's really important to do is think about leading and lagging indicators, and just, think about that in your evaluation plan as you set it up. So many of the previous measures that we've been looking at today would be considered lagging indicators, which means that they're output measurements. And that means that we've sort of looked at it once it's done. And these are often the types of measures that we include in reports, right? So for the last 3 months or this year, we accomplished X, Y, and Z, and that goes out into the report. And that's great. This is very important information. But it's also important to measure the activities that we engage in to bring out those outcomes, right? So a lot happens to make that happen. So I've been trying to weave that in a little bit to what we've been talking about today. And that could be, those phone calls that you make, this to change story that you've crafted. So all of the prep action to get to that point could be considered leading indicators. So the example here, I just put safety as an example because it's super clear. So we see, an individual with a hard hat, and then we see some injuries. And so the leading indicator is we hope to decrease the amount of head injuries on site by enforcing hard hat rules. Great. Lagging indicator, we still have serious injuries, but there are less head injuries and more other body parts, right? And so we've got two different measures here. One is leading up to it, one is after the fact. Okay, so looking at your activities in setting up your pathways towards apprenticeship or even entry points, right? So a lot of us, that might be entry points. Think about the activities that you do to create that success. The phone calls, the smaller stuff, right? The phone calls, the emails. Sometimes it takes, 5 emails to get someone online. That's fine. Count it, right? You might want to get that down to 2. All right. So this all brings us into our final piece for today, is wrapping everything that we've been talking about into a hypothesis statement. So let's jump right into that. Again, talking a lot today, sending you home with some good stuff. So there's lots of different formats of hypothesis statements. And we're just going to share one that I've been working with over the past few years today. So I'll talk about it in general, and then we'll come down and give you an example. So once we have an idea of what we want to do, we set a hypothesis statement to help us articulate that goal, what we hope to achieve, for whom, and why. So there are many different templates of a hypothesis statement. So when I was in product design, we used very different one. I didn't really resonate with it. The example I'm going to share with you today is more from training, which is why I resonate with it. Just find what works for you. But generally, when we're looking at these hypothesis statements, we want to see, and we've got a couple examples on the slide here of things you might want to include in that. So that would be like something about the product, service, or solution, a user group or persona. So somebody's involved in that, a doer. The ideal end results, or business outcomes. So those are all different things that we might see within a hypothesis statement. So the one that I'd like to share, and this is on your handout. So again, I'm kind of rushing us through this a little bit, but this material is on your handout. And I was going to do an activity on this. A, we don't really have time. And B, I think it's actually quite challenging to do that on the fly. So I'm going to send you home with that. But I want to break this down first so that you can do that. Okay. So this comes from Kathy Moore's book, Map It, which is an instructional design book. It's really good format, I think, if you're building things like programs or processes or trying to make a change for that. It's not going to work for all, but I think it's a good use case for this, for our entry points into increasing enrollments in apprenticeship programs. So I'm going to break it down. So on the slide, what you see is sort of like the format, and then underneath that is an example. So we start with a measure we already use. So we just talked a bunch about measures, right? So number of businesses, number of students enrolled, et cetera, et cetera. And this might be something that you're familiar with. Usually that's a good idea. If you're starting something net new, a net new program, then you might want to sort of think about what's familiar, but then add into that something that is new. So a measure that you know about and you can measure. And then we look at, what are we going to do with that? It will increase or decrease, really, because that's what we're trying to move the needle. So how are we moving the needle with this project? And I'm going to take, a page out of my old in the product world boss's book by sharing, this is hard. And sometimes you just have to guess, right? And you may be wildly off, but what we really need to do is just draw a line in the sand. So use what you know, throw a number out there. And this is what happens when you get to those analysis points in the project. You're just like, well, we're way off of this. Is it because the number we selected at the beginning was off, or that our activities are off? So it's a discussion point. You have to select something. You have to pick something to go for. It may change. Don't get too attached to it. We're just heading for a target. We want to have a date on there. So by which date? We have to contain it by time, so I like to keep things within a year, but again, that depends on how large of a project we're working on. So you may have different points at different times throughout that project. And then finally, the last piece in here is we're going to do something people in the group will do something. So here, my example is really kind of looking at enrollments in registered apprenticeships will increase by 5%. I don't know, by the end of 2024, after we launch our new apprenticeship marketing campaign to parents. It's probably not a great, those numbers probably don't make sense. However, I just wanted to show you an example from ideas that we've been talking about in the last few series. Okay, I'm just looking at what's next. I'd like to go through one example. I have two examples on the slides. I think we have time to go through one example before we wrap up. And again, we'll send the slides over to you with the with two examples. Rochelle, can we look at the next slide? Awesome. Okay. I'm just going to wrap this around a bit. So what we see on here is, again, another example that I've brought forward from what we came up with in our last session. And what I've done is I've broken it down because these weren't my ideas and I had to run with them. I started with just sort of like trying to anchor the end goal. Like, what are we really trying to do here? And so if this was my project and I was going to take it forward, then my end goal would be something about like creating relationships and partnerships with employers. That's kind of the end goal. Engage interest in apprenticeships. So we may all have a slightly different end goal, but it's just good to have one as a thought there. Measures that I thought about in this would be, say, numbers of businesses engaged, right? Again, you may want to define what engaged means, but number of businesses would be a good quantitative measure. And then number of businesses interested in apprenticeship conversation, right? So take that further, like, okay, we're engaged, but how many of those are actually going to move forward with apprenticeships? So those are a couple of different numbers. And so a hypothesis statement that I had come up with here is number of businesses engaged on the topic of apprenticeship in IT. So sort of focusing on IT will increase by 5% by the end of 2023 as our business relations unit reaches out to employers through IT training programs. So again, it takes me a minute to kind of think through it and, sort of crunch down all of the things that we've been talking about today. But then that sentence becomes sort of that important thing. I'm going to communicate this to people, and then I'm going to hang everything on my evaluation strategy off of this, because this is our North Star. This is where we're heading. All right. folks, I barely breathe. I've been talking your ear off. We're going to skip the next example because we've got about 6 minutes left. I'm going to send that over to you in a slide. Rochelle, can I get us to move down to the action items slide, please, just for time's sake. So again, everything you see on the board here will send over to you, but I'm just also looking at the time and I want to get you out in time. Now, on your handout, there is an exercise for you to do 2 things. One, create a hypothesis statement. So I've got that all broken down in the handout. And then the next thing is really to look at what action items are you going to take next. And I'm asking you this question for those of you who may be joining today. So this is your first part of the series, or those of you who may have been with us the entire time. And I like to think about actions again in the achievable space. So I'm giving you like something to do this week, something to do this month, and something to do over the next 3 months. And that could be watch the videos of this session. It could be talking about it with our team. So another one could be just download the handout and go over it. So give us, if you will, a couple of items that you might do over the next few months or next week or next month. It would be really great if we could see some of those ideas in chat. And pardon me, I usually offer more engagement. And today I did more talking than I usually do. So thanks for your patience there. But I would love to see any action items in chat. And then we'll just sort of wrap up our session. So I'll give you some time to do that while I help us wrap up for today. So today, again, we talked a lot about, defining success. And so as the final part in this 3-part series on increasing apprenticeship enrollments at the local workforce board level, we're closing by focusing on measuring success in our efforts. Again, this started with a report, so we want to be able to report back sort of the elements that we have succeeded on. We looked at different measures, and then we created a hypothesis statement. So again, next steps for you moving forward could be download the handout. Please do that. It's a really great combination with the videos and the slides that we'll send today. And I'm just going to say shout out to Jennifer. Thanks for sharing some action items. I think that's really great. So Jennifer is going to review the slides, run the exercise on a program idea. Awesome. Super great. Do that. And the next 3 months, evaluate program progress. Jennifer, reach out to us. Tell us how it goes. I'm really curious. And then Brenda's also shared some action items. Share the presentation with your team. Thank you. I think it's really something you want to take back and then find the pieces that work for you and resonate for you and move forward with them. Yeah, awesome. Next 3 months, roll out communication plan. Yeah. To implement better measures. Yes. Okay, great. So even communication plan, that's great. Beautiful stuff, everybody. All right. So I'm glad you're going to do all those things. So yes, download the handout, talk to your team, set up a meeting to initiate an action item. You're doing that. That's great. And then the last thing for today, if you will, we would really appreciate it. We do have a short evaluation that we would like. It's 4 questions. We would really love it if you could fill it out. You could say, she taught too much today. That's fine. I got it. But we'll also send out those slides to you. We do a lot of webinars and capacity building here at Purpose Co. So it's really good for us to get a sense of like what worked for you and what didn't. 2 minutes to go before we get back to work or lunch or wherever you're going next. Is just to say a big thanks to all of you. This has been 3 parts. Apprenticeship programs, not easy. This is a big thing to move forward. And so I appreciate everyone's keenness to show up and get that started. The more I learn about apprenticeship, the more I really want to push it. So I was really glad to be part of this session today. We love questions at Purpose Co. So please send us a link or send us a question or connect with us. And as we said at the top, connect with that website for the Center of Excellence that Jackie has shared with us, and that you'll see all the videos and all of the materials for our sessions. So Okay, I'm gonna breathe now. You guys could all take a rest from this like monologue. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining today. Have a great afternoon.